Hello, New Prospect. Welcome to RTB 2021 for October 11th, 2021. Hope you're having a wonderful day so far. I want to thank once again Pastor Drew, Pastor Jay for filling in last week. I know they did a great job, and I know you enjoyed hearing from them. And they'll probably be filling in several more times as we finish up. Believe it or not, we only have a couple more months left of RTBs, and we'll be done for the year. And we'll read through the entirety of the Bible, and frankly, read through some parts, like the New Testament, twice in the book of Psalms. So getting close. But our text for today, we have 1 Kings 14, Colossians 1, so starting the book of Colossians today, once again. And then we have Ezekiel 44, which is right in the heart of a really kind of challenging part of Ezekiel. And then finally, we have Psalm 97 and Psalm 98. So I'm going to jump in right with the Psalms. And again, we've been through these before. So Psalm 97, 98, we have two Psalms that are in a section of Psalms known as, and we've talked about these before, I believe, the Yahweh Malak Psalms. So Yahweh, the name of the Lord, the God who causes to come into being, and then Malak in Hebrew means rules or reigns. And so that actually comes from the first words that we see in several of these texts, like in Psalm 97 here, where it begins, the Lord reigns, Yahweh Malak, which begin, and all these Psalms, Psalm 95 through 99, and also Psalm 93, all focus in on the reign of God as king. So the predominant picture here is God as a king who's reigning over his creation. Kings do several things, right? Kings don't not only reign and make life peaceful and good for their people, but they also judge. They also are kings that fight for their people and bring salvation. And God is doing all those things in this text. This is a king also that his kingship is universal. Look at verse 6 of Psalm 97. All peoples have seen his glory. You'll see echoes of these Psalms where it talks about singing a new song in the book of Revelation. So there's this anticipatory aspect to God's kingship. We're looking forward to that eternal reign and singing this new song. We see God's salvation once again being demonstrated and renewed. And so we'll be able to sing another song of what God is continuing to do for his people. And so these are wonderful Psalms going through this section of the Psalter that speak of God reigning as king. And this is not just predominant in this section of Psalms. That's a major image, as we've seen as we've gone through these reading or preaching through the Psalms this summer. We've seen quite a few of these Psalms focus in on that aspect of God's character. So that's Psalm 97 and 98. We'll go over to Colossians. So these are the two texts that we've seen before, Colossians and also Psalms. So Colossians, a couple of things just by way of introduction to the book of Colossians. So Colossae was a town in Asia Minor. So modern day Turkey, about 100 miles east of Ephesus. And you'll notice that there are a lot of parallels between the book of Colossians and the book of Ephesians. Many of the same themes, even some of the same kind of wording. It's the same kind of purpose as this encyclical letter meant to be going passed around to various churches to encourage them. Paul did actually found the church at Colossae, but he writes to them to encourage them and warn them, primarily warning against false teachers. Now, the church is actually doing well. If you read through verses 3 through 8 here, Paul says that he's thanking God always for them, praying for them. He's heard about their faith that they have in Christ Jesus and the love that they have for the saints, and these types of things. So they're actually doing well, but there's always this danger of false teaching. Now, we'll probably see a little bit more of this in chapter 2 in terms of the elements of the heresy that's threatening this church. But and I may save that discussion more for tomorrow. But we do see some heretical teaching in this church that Paul is going against. But one of the things that he argues here in this text is that that he argues for the supremacy of Christ. Apparently, there was some veneration of angels, angelic beings going on in the church at Colossae. And so Paul argues instead that what should be the person who should be venerated above or given honor to above all others and preeminent above all others is Christ. And he does so in one of the most wonderful texts that we have in the totality of the New Testament, in Colossians 1:15 through 20. And I think you've heard me talk about this before, but there are four major what we call Christological texts in the New Testament, four major texts that really speak of the exaltation of Christ, the deity of Jesus, and his supremacy. You have Hebrews 1, you have John 1, which is that famous prologue, the Word became flesh and dwelt among us. In the beginning was the Word, and the Word was with God, and the Word was God. Then you have also Philippians 2, which we just saw a few days ago, have this attitude which is in yourselves, which was also in Christ Jesus. Talks about how every knee will bow and every tongue will confess that Jesus is Lord, to the glory of God the Father. But then you also have Colossians 1:15 through 20. And it speaks of Jesus as the image of the invisible God, the firstborn of all creation. So it speaks of the supremacy of his person. He is given the status as that perfect image bearer of God, the one who fulfills the role of ruling for him. But he's also one who not only rules all things as this image bearer, but he created all things, both in heaven and on earth, and all things were created through him and for him. He's also the head of the body of the church. So he is not just one who is head over the totality of creation, but he's head specifically and personally over the church itself. And so when you read through this, one of the things that I think is interesting, it talks about how God reconciled all things through Jesus. You think of the two major roles of God in the Old Testament, of God the Father in the Old Testament. You think of God's redemption, and you think of God's creation, and his rule and reign over that creation. Well, here's what we have Jesus fulfilling. So it shows Jesus as God ultimately, and that's why I say this is one of those Christological texts that shows the supremacy of Christ in all things. So the beautiful text that we find here in Colossians 1:15 through 20. That brings us to, we'll go over to Ezekiel. So we haven't been in Ezekiel. I haven't been with you guys since I think I left off with Ezekiel 36. So I get to talk a little bit about Ezekiel 40 through 48. So remember that in this section of Ezekiel, starting really with Ezekiel 34, going through Ezekiel 48, we have a section of Ezekiel that's focusing on restoration. So we've had some of these great pictures of restoration, like the Valley of Dry Bones a few days ago. You've had the new covenant that is being brought in and where the heart of stone is being replaced with the heart of flesh. You have the Davidic king that's prophesied of in both Ezekiel 37 and Ezekiel 34. Speaks of course, that king that will shepherd his people. Then you have, of course, the vision of the two sticks being merged together. That shows how God is going to rejoin Israel and Judah in this new covenant. But then we get to chapters 40 through 48, one of the more difficult texts in all the Bible, I think, where we have this kind of vision of Ezekiel of a final temple. Now, this is strange, and we'll talk more about this. We have a few days to talk about this because it is a significant vision in the book of Ezekiel, but it's also really misunderstood in many Christian circles these days, and what the purpose and intent of it is confusing, I think. But for now, at least, I think what we can say about this temple is that it really is something that fulfills all the previous restorations that are spoken of, whether it's the new covenant, whether it's the Davidic king, whether it's Israel and Judah being joined together, whether it's the heart of stone being replaced with the heart of flesh. All those different restorations that Ezekiel talks about in response to the exile. Right. So as Israel is returning from exile and they're being restored to right covenant relationship in a new covenant, all these things kind of reach their culmination with this new temple. Just like, by the way, when God, when David first becomes king, the culmination of all those things comes when the temple is ultimately built, right? And then, of course, when Israel emerges from the Exodus, the culmination of all those events is when God has his tabernacle built and he dwells among his people. All the previous restorations are incomplete with this one because it's now, that's really the sign that all things have been made right, that God's covenant people and God are now right together. A good way of looking at this may be, you think of the exile of the Israel and well, you think of the relationship between God and Israel as being this kind of marital relationship, as Ezekiel has used that image quite a few times. So this is a covenant relationship. And what happened with the exile is that Israel and God became estranged. They separated. The covenant had been broken by Israel. They had committed spiritual adultery. And so God promises them a restored covenant. Well, what is the culmination if you have a husband and wife who are estranged? What is the culmination of them coming back together? Well, they come back together, right? They are now living together again, and they're dwelling with each other under the same house. And so here we have God being with his people again as being the culmination of all those restorations. And keep in mind, remember in the book of Ezekiel, what happened? You had that glory get up and depart, Ezekiel 8-11, and left the temple. We talked about that a few weeks ago. And now we've got Ezekiel promising that glory will one day return. And that's exactly what happens here in the temple. So the vision could not have come before other descriptions of restoration. Instead, the permanent purification that's promised in other texts had to happen. That heart of stone and heart of flesh, and the purification of Israel had to happen before the glory to return. So we'll talk more about the description of this temple and the kind of significance of it, just in how we're to understand it in future days. So tune in for that in future days. That finally brings us to the book of 1 Kings and 1 Kings 14. Remember what the purpose of 1 Kings is, really the whole entire books of Kings. Remember that this is history told through the lens of the exile. The person who wrote this is one who experienced the exile. And so he's describing events that history through the point of view of how do we get here? How do we end up in this situation? Well, one of the people that is the main responsibility, who has the main responsibility for Israel's downfall, is the king Jeroboam. And Jeroboam once again takes center stage in this story. Remember who Jeroboam was. So he was the king of the northern kingdom of Israel, that first king of the northern kingdom of Israel. So Rehoboam and Jeroboam are both kind of featured in this chapter in 1 Kings 14. But Rehoboam, of course, was the king of the line of David, Solomon's son. And because of his heavy-handedness on the people, they separated out. The northern 10 tribes, kind of a bloodless civil war. They went along and said, we're done. And they go and they call Jeroboam out of exile in Egypt and make him king. Well, Jeroboam, the first thing he does, if you remember a few chapters ago, is build these golden calves, really similar to what happens in the book of Exodus, right? In Exodus 32-33. And what happens after that? Well, he says, behold your gods who brought you out of the land of Egypt, out of the house of slavery. And so what he's doing there, by the way, is he's moving the center of worship to the northern kingdom, because this is kind of a political ploy as much as it is a religious one, because he's wanting to have the loyalty of those northern tribes. And if he still has the people in the northern kingdom going down to Jerusalem in the southern kingdom to worship, that's not going to work out too well. So he wants to consolidate his power, and so he moves the worship and the capital to the north. But Jeroboam becomes kind of a symbol in the rest of Kings for all that's wrong with the northern kingdom kingship. So just as all the other kings are kind of compared in the south, at least, are compared to David, Jeroboam, all the other kings in the northern kingdom are compared to him. And pretty much not just pretty much, every single one of the northern kingdom kings of those northern tribes. So remember, the northern kingdom is also called Israel in the text. Every single one of their kings is false, is following after the same pattern of Jeroboam, participating in this same kind of idolatry, attributing God's great deliverance to these false gods, not to God himself. Well, in this text, Jeroboam and his wife find out that their son is sick, Abijah. And so Jeroboam says to his wife, hey, you go down to this prophet in the southern kingdom, and he will tell you what's going to happen to our son, but disguise yourself, because you don't want to let him know that he's my son, because maybe he'll, if he just thinks it's some general person, maybe he'll say that God will heal him. Well, that's not what happens. God tells him that Jeroboam's wife is coming down, and the son, he prophesies that the son will indeed die, and it's part of this oncoming judgment that Jeroboam will experience, which will be kind of symbolic of the oncoming judgment that's coming on Israel as a whole. And then when we get to the last part of this chapter, we have Rehoboam coming back in. This is kind of the end of Rehoboam's reign. And we see, of course, that Rehoboam is symbolic of all that's wrong in the southern kingdom. And he is doing things like, and here's that phrase, we saw this a lot in the book of Judges, that Judah did evil in the sight of the Lord. This is not just any evil, this is the evil in the sight of the Lord. And what is it that they're doing? They're committing committing idolatry. They've got these high places and sacred pillars and Asherim on the high hill and every luxuriant tree, and they have even male cult prostitutes in the land, and they're committing abominations. So they're doing what's right in their own eyes, and they're becoming like the Canaanites around them, just kind of like exactly what happened in the book of Judges. But this becomes the epitome of what would happen in the rest of the story of the southern kingdom as well. And so we have here the very first kings of the divided kingdom. So now, with Rehoboam, the kingdom is now divided between the north and the south, between Israel in the north, Judah in the south. The very first kings of both of them are setting the pattern for how the rest of the history is going to play out. So remember that this is what the author is trying to do. He's saying, how do we end up here? It's placed at the feet of those kings. What do we need? We need a king who will not lead us in this way. That's what Ezekiel points to from exile. And that's, of course, what the Psalms point to. A future king who would judge rightly, live righteously, rule justly, not take advantage of those who are placed underneath him, provide for those, protect them, do all those things. That's what our King Jesus does. So hope they have a wonderful rest of the day. These are some neat texts to kind of chew on and meditate on. And I hope you have a great rest of the day on this day, October 11th, 2021.